Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, co-hosted by Pulse Canada and Protein Industries Canada on marketing faba bean ingredients for dog food in the US. My name is Julianne Curran, and I'm the VP of Market Innovation with Pulse Canada. My co-host for today's webinar is Chris Marinangeli, Director of the Regulatory Centre of Excellence at Protein Industries Canada. We're very pleased to have Brandon Walters as our expert speaker today. Brandon is Senior Manager of Toxicology, Feed, and Regulatory Affairs within the Food and Nutrition Group at Intertek. Today, Brandon will be presenting results of a feasibility assessment that was commissioned by Pulse Canada and Protein Industries Canada on the regulatory pathways for faba beans to be used in the US pet food industry. So just before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. So you can use the chat panel to the right side of the stream to chat with other attendees or to ask questions. We've reserved time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions you may have. We will also be recording today's webinar and will circulate a link to everyone who has registered. We'll also provide a copy of Intertek's report that was commissioned by our organizations. And you can also access that report directly below the stage. In our follow-up communications, we'll also send you a link to a survey that you can complete, and this will give you an opportunity to provide some input on future direction of research into this area and what you want to see prioritized. So before we turn things over to Brandon, Chris and I are going to provide a little bit of context on the opportunity for faba beans in pet food. Faba bean is not a new crop. It's been grown historically for thousands of years. However, it is a relatively new crop in Canada. That being said, Canada's faba bean production has been growing and has become more stable over the last 5 years. Faba beans are a really attractive option for producers that are looking to include a pulse crop in their rotations, especially because faba beans are less susceptible to root rot, which more commonly affects peas and lentils. The Canadian pulse industry is committed to growing faba bean production through coordinated efforts in developing and producing new faba bean varieties, particularly varieties that are best suited for value-added utilization and for human consumption. There is quite a bit of domestic use for faba beans here in Canada for feed, but the US is also becoming a larger export market for Canadian faba beans, as you can see by the bars in the dark blue color. This also coincides with the growing use of faba bean ingredients in North America, particularly in the packaged food sector, mostly in food products. This figure shows new product launches with faba bean ingredients from 2015 to 2021. Faba bean protein ingredients in particular are most frequently used in new product launches, as you can see by the bars shaded in the dark blue as well as the green color. When we're looking specifically at new product launches in the North American pet food industry over the last few years, pulses as a category were second only to wheat as the plant-based ingredient found in new dog food, snack, and treat launches, and that's indicated by the dark blue bars. Pulses are actually the most frequently used plant-based ingredient in dry and wet dog food and in dry cat food. As far as pet food ingredient use goes, the US is an important market, as you can see by the number of SKUs by country on the right-hand side of the slides. In terms of all available SKUs for pet food products in the US, as shown in the figure on the left-hand side, the most commonly used ingredients are wheat flour and soy ingredients. However, pea flour is also found quite frequently in pet food SKUs. So just as faba beans represent another option for a pulse to be included on the farm in crop rotations, Faba beans also have potential to be used as another pulse option in pet food, with many similarities to peas that can be leveraged. I'm going to turn things over to Chris now to talk more about the characteristics of faba beans that may provide an opportunity for the pet food market.
Thank you, Julianne. And, when we talk about pulses in general for use of human food, increasing use in livestock and feed, and now the pet food industry, there's an acknowledgement that we're living in a changing world and changing food environment. The recently commissioned Eat Lancet report indicated that food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. But given the value proposition around pulses and it's moving across diets and implementation into food systems, livestock and pet food are less so an exception to this. And it is a value proposition for including pulses and specific pulses in these ingredient and food platforms. Protein is also often underpinned as the nutritional lever and sustainable lever for utilization of pulses in human food, in animal feed and diets. And it's no exception here when you talk to some of the animal nutritionists as they discuss the utilization and the value of pulses and ingredient formulations. When we look at faba bean compared to other pulses, there are certainly some nutritional benchmarks that should be acknowledged and can be a large value proposition for use in pet foods, particularly when we look at protein and replacing maybe perhaps some of the animal protein in pet foods. On a per kilogram basis, faba beans have more protein generally than other pulses. Obviously, there's a fiber play there, and obviously some micronutrient options there that could be of benefit in formulating foods to meet nutritional requirements in dog foods as you start to reduce some perhaps other ingredients and replace them with faba beans and other pulses and ingredient formulations. Start to fractionate faba beans. One of the benefits of faba beans as an ingredient, it's the ability to fractionate and utilization and to create new ingredient platforms for faba beans across pet food. So even dehauling, you're going to be concentrating the fiber of the protein in that cotyledon portion. That could again be an increased value proposition for propping up the protein content in pet foods, in diets. And it's important to note the levers that we pull in terms of a value proposition for pulses in general across animal diets and human diets. And it generally focuses on things like nutrition and sustainability. And when we look at the value proposition for pet owners when they're choosing foods for their dogs, it is important to note that nutrition is a primary lever that they are looking at when choosing foods for their diets, which is very important. And even in terms of sustainability, this is a fairly old slide now, but looking at faba bean, the sustainability, the environmental sustainability attributes of faba bean, particularly around nitrogen and nitrogen fixation, compared to other pulses, and also Canada's value proposition in this space. Compared to other pulses, faba beans have a fairly high sustainability or nitrogen fixation profile. And Canada generally does better than other countries when we look at the kilogram shoot nitrogen per hectare of crop. But other things to be cognizant of that consumers are looking for when we're choosing the value proposition of faba beans and other pulse ingredients in pet food. Consumers are cognizant of price, the specific ingredients in the food, whether or not your pet likes it, which is very, very important. And sustainability, unfortunately, at this time, falls a little bit short in terms of the perception in the pet food sector, but that nutrition lever is fairly strong. But I do want to focus on, the things that we look at as humans in terms of our food choices with respect to taste and price. These things are equally as important when we look at pet food. And just as an example, this was a study done at the University of Guelph looking at animal versus vegetable-based diets in pet food. The vegetable-based ingredients were based on primarily pulses and soy, and the level of consumption and interest in consumption was a little bit less for the vegetable diet. So those primary, when we're formulating pet foods, to consider things like faba beans and other pulses, these are things to consider. But the value with respect to the opportunities for processing faba beans into multiple ingredient platforms for use across food systems, including pet food, is growing, and it does exist. And this is evidenced by a few studies that have been published starting to evaluate the performance of Faba bean and pet food platforms, specifically around dog foods, evaluating nutritional efficacy, evaluating any detriments to health and well-being of animals. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Brandon Walters, who is the Manager of Toxicology and Feed and Regulatory Affairs within the Food and Nutrition Group at Intertek. His area of specialty primarily focuses on regulatory authorization of animal feed ingredients in the European Union, United States, and Canada. He has extensive experience in preparing both food and feed submissions and notifications for review by global regulatory agencies and organizations, including the European Commission, the European Food Safety Authority, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Health Canada, and the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Additionally, Brandon has a wealth of experience assisting clients with navigating and understanding the recent EU transparency regulation submissions under the EU regulations for genetically modified food and feed. He received his master's in science in animal and poultry science and toxicology from the University of Guelph and received his BSc in biomedical toxicology with honors from the University of Guelph as well. Presently, he's been working in the area of food and feed consulting for the past 10 years. And with that, Brandon, I'll hand things over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chris, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank all the attendees for joining us today in this presentation, which aims to summarize the feasibility assessment for the marketing of Faba bean ingredients in dog food in the United States. As a general overview of the presentation today, first I'll go through a brief introduction and outline the scope of the feasibility assessment. And next I'll discuss the regulatory background and strategy as it pertains to the marketing of Faba bean ingredients in dog food in the United States. Then the findings of the feasibility assessment will be discussed. This will be followed by a summary and Intertek's recommendations for marketing Faba bean ingredients in dog food in the US. So to start, we'll go into the introduction and scope of the assessment. So Intertek was commissioned by PIC and Pulse Canada to provide a regulatory strategy and feasibility assessment for marketing Faba bean, whole flours, and ingredient derivatives, such as protein and fiber in dog food in the US. There are 3 regulatory pathways for animal feed ingredients. Those are the food additive regulations, ingredient definition requests through the Association of American Feed Control Officials, or AAFCO, and the generally recognized as safe GRAS evaluation process. We considered only the AAFCO and GRAS process in the regulatory strategy based on the composition of the Faba ingredients and the regulatory routes of other similar ingredients, as we will discuss later. Information from specific manufacturers was not provided, so the feasibility assessment was more generalized and considered publicly available information on the identity, utility, and safety of Faba bean ingredients. The scope of the regulatory strategy and feasibility assessment was kept to the federal level, and any individual practices at the state level were not considered. Though, to clarify on this point, the scope of the state practices typically relate to ingredient or facility registration. The next section will go into more detail on the regulatory background and strategy. But first, we'll get into the framework of the AAFCO ingredient definition process and the GRAS evaluation. At the federal level, any substance added to food must be subject to a food additive regulation or exempt from authorization because it has been concluded to be generally recognized as safe for the intended conditions of use. Additionally, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, maintains a memorandum of understanding with AAFCO, which states that the FDA would not take regulatory action against any AAFCO ingredient definitions. This memorandum has been in place for decades and will likely continue forward for the foreseeable future. To give some background on what AAFCO is, it's an organization of state and federal regulators and subject matter experts, as well as members of industry. AAFCO maintains an official publication which includes their model bills and regulations, as well as a chapter of ingredient definitions. The model bills and regulations are adopted by most states and provides a generally consistent framework for the regulation of feed ingredients across these states. Although, as mentioned previously, there is some variation in state laws, which we'll not get into. AAFCO ingredient definitions are for ingredients of uncomplicated origin that are typically included in feed for their nutritive properties. The process starts with the submission of an information package containing a definition request, which is sent to an AAFCO investigator responsible for their part of the official publication. After an initial suitability check, the investigator forwards the request to the FDA for an evaluation of the safety and utility of the ingredient. Following a favorable outcome from the FDA's evaluation, the AAFCO investigator proposes the ingredient definition to the AAFCO Ingredient Definition Committee, who meet periodically throughout the year. After a favorable vote, the ingredient definition is then forwarded to the AAFCO general membership, who will vote it into the official publication. First as tentative, and then after a period of time as official. The general membership convenes to vote on new ingredient definitions twice a year. As a result of these committee-based meetings, the authorization of ingredient definition requests may be longer than the GRAS process. To discuss the GRAS process, any ingredient may be exempt from being approved under a feed additive regulation if it is GRAS for the intended use. The same quality and quantity of evidence is required for GRAS, AAFCO requests, and feed additive petitions. However, to satisfy the general recognition part of GRAS, safety information must be published in a peer-reviewed journal. The GRAS process can be carried out independently by industry and evaluated by an expert panel. Once determined to be GRAS, a company can legally market the ingredient in the US. However, many feed manufacturers and state regulators do not prefer GRAS self-determinations that have not been evaluated by the US FDA, and as a result, there can be delays in gaining access to individual state markets. GRAS conclusions may be notified to the US FDA. The FDA reviews the notice and issues a letter stating that they'll either have no questions with the safety of the ingredient or that they have safety concerns under the intended conditions of use. In many cases, the FDA will approach a notifier with their concerns and suggest the notifier withdraw the GRAS notice before the FDA issues a letter concluding that the notice is not GRAS. Regardless of the outcome, the FDA letter is published on the FDA's website in a database. Finally, in order to align GRAS notifications with AAFCO, AAFCO has started automatically adding all GRAS notices with no question letters to the official publication. Presently, there are no existing animal food additive regulations, GRAS notices with no question letters, or AAFCO ingredient definitions for faba bean ingredients. However, there are AAFCO ingredient definitions for pulse fiber, pulse flour, pulse protein, and pulse starch. Unfortunately, the ingredient definitions are limited to just lentils and peas. While the existing ingredient definitions are not applicable for faba beans right now, their presence provides a possible route for the future regulatory approval of faba bean ingredients. Based on this, the suggested regulatory pathway is to submit an ingredient definition request to amend the existing pulse definitions so that they include faba beans. The GRAS self-determination with notification route is still an alternative. However, the route would be more costly because of fees for expert panelists. Additionally, the GRAS notification process is non-iterative, meaning that if the notice is submitted and there are issues, there wouldn't be an opportunity for major amendments, and instead, the notice would need to be resubmitted, pushing it to the back of the evaluation queue. Finally, and most critically, and as mentioned previously, the safety information would need to be published in a peer-reviewed journal for a GRAS notification. Now that I've covered the regulatory environment and the suggested pathway to market faba bean ingredients, I will provide a summary of the feasibility assessment. So Intertech conducted the feasibility assessment using the FDA Guidance for Industry 221, which provides recommendations for information to be included in an animal feed additive petition. This guidance is regarded as the standard for all U.S. animal feed submissions and notifications. The feasibility assessment was also completed or complemented by other regulatory guidance from the FDA and AAFCO. Only general guidance on information requirements is provided since Pulse Canada and PIC were unable to provide data on specific faba bean ingredients. For illustrative purposes though, technical data from the Human Food GRAS Notice 879 on faba bean protein isolate from faba bean flour was used. As part of the AAFCO ingredient definition request or GRAS evaluation, the following information will be needed. With identity and raw materials being discussed first, the ingredient will need to be identified by way of a description of what it is and its physical and chemical properties. It is likely the faba bean ingredient would be used for its nutritive properties, so guaranteed minimum values for specific nutrients would need to be declared. If the ingredient provides any other technical effects in dog food, this must also be stated, and then supporting information would need to be provided for those technical effects. Compositional data will need to be presented to describe the constituents, nutritive profile, and undesirable substances, if any, in the ingredient. The manufacturing process for the ingredient will also need to be covered, and all the raw materials and processing aids involved will need to be described quantitatively. The safety of each of these materials will need to be supported. Usually this can be accomplished by citing regulations or other approvals for direct use of these raw materials and processing aids in animal food. The manufacturing process will need to be described and a flowchart will need to be provided. The individual steps in the process should be described and include when individual raw materials or processing aids are included. Procedures for identification and control of contamination or removal of anti-nutritional factors would also need to be described in the production process. Removal of anti-nutritional factors will also need to consider the impact on the nutritive profile, if any, for the ingredient. For GRAS notifications, the complete production process would be considered by the expert panel, while a more simplified description can be supplied to the FDA. This is because of the GRAS notice will be published on the FDA website. An example of the abbreviated production flow chart from GRAS Notice 879 is provided on the slide to illustrate this point. Specifications and certificates of analysis for at least 3 consecutive batches will need to be included. The specifications will establish the key properties of the ingredient and are used for supporting the quality and safety of the ingredient. A faba bean ingredient may include in its specifications the following as relevant: organoleptic properties, physical chemical properties, nutritive properties such as carbohydrate, crude fiber, or protein, toxic elements, particularly arsenic, lead, mercury, and cadmium, as well as any other toxic elements used in the production process, and microbial parameters. Additional to this, depending on the production process of the faba bean itself, pesticides may also need to be considered, though not in the specifications. The method of analysis also needs to be stated and should be either from a recognized method by a national or international organization or a validated internal method. This slide is a copy of the specifications submitted for 879, the GRAS notice for faba bean protein isolate, and is provided to illustrate the information that would need to be included. For faba bean protein isolate, the key parameter was protein, and specifications were provided for 4 main toxic elements, as well as for total plate count, E. coli, Staphylococcus aureus, Salmonella, and yeasts and molds. Other information on organoleptic and physical and chemical properties were provided in other parts of the GRAS notice. The stability of the faba bean ingredient will need to be demonstrated, both on its own over the proposed shelf life of the ingredient and when mixed into feed for a period of at least 3 months. The stability can be demonstrated both using real-time stability and accelerated stability, in which increased temperature and humidity is used. The parameters to consider in the feasibility study should include any guaranteed amounts, for example, crude fiber, and indicators of contamination, such as the microbial parameters in the ingredient specification. It's also necessary to demonstrate that the ingredient be mixed homogeneously into animal feed. For both the stability and mixability in feed, the analysis will need to be done using representative feed samples of types that reflect the feeds that the faba bean ingredients will be added to. For example, if the ingredient is intended to be added to pellets, the stability study should pelletize the feed according to current industry practices. A measure of the concentration of nutrients should be conducted before or after pelleting to demonstrate heat stability of the ingredient. Feed stability studies should also use representative packaging for the feed, for example, cans if the ingredient is added to wet dog food. For the intended use, the ingredient must also be stated. And the intended use of the ingredient. The intended use relates to the levels of inclusion of the ingredient in animal feed and the purpose for which it is added. Industry stakeholders have indicated to PIC and Pulse Canada that they are interested in marketing faba bean whole flours and ingredient derivatives for use in dog food, and the main purpose of these ingredients would be to act as sources of particular nutrients. To support the intended use of faba bean ingredient, the AAFCO request or GRAS conclusion would need to provide minimum guarantees for the relevant nutrients and the maximum inclusion level for the ingredients in feed. As well, it would need to be stated if the ingredient is meant to substitute other sources of the relevant nutrients or be added to background intake. It is rather straightforward to support an intended use of a nutrient in feed and can be done through compositional analysis and estimates of intake. From these parameters, it can be determined if the intended use of the faba bean ingredient would meet the nutrient requirements for dogs. The intended use levels are also relevant to the safety assessment of the ingredient and can be used when determining an adequate margin of safety. As noted previously, for any kind of ingredient that is going to be making claims of a technical or functional effect, efficacy studies would need to be provided. As to the safety for ingredients can be established by demonstrating a safe history of use or through scientific procedures. Since there is no sufficient history of use of faba bean ingredients in dog food, scientific procedures would need to be used in any future definition request or GRAS conclusion. Scientific procedures include compositional analysis, studies in animals, and in vitro and in vivo studies of specific safety endpoints. As an additional consideration, the evidence supporting that the intended use of an ingredient is GRAS must be published in a peer-reviewed journal. In addition to the usual requirements for supporting safety, faba bean ingredients must also include a discussion on the potential for the occurrence of anti-nutritional effects. To illustrate this, recently the US FDA has investigated the occurrence of dilated cardiomyopathy or DCM in dogs consuming grain-free diets, formulated with potatoes and pulse ingredients. In the report that was issued in 2019, which contained adverse event reports from consumers, lentils and peas were commonly reported in these diets for dogs, while faba bean was only mentioned in one adverse event report, and pulses without further clarification was reported in 2 reports. While the current data does not show a clear link between DCM and faba bean consumption, a search of the published literature provides a few plausible mechanisms by which DCM could occur. There is therefore awareness of the potential issue, and further evidence to support the safety of faba bean ingredients will be requested by FDA. It's likely that this parameter would need to be investigated in a target animal safety study, which is discussed later. Other anti-nutritive effects have been recognized in humans, leading to hemolytic anemia. There is again no evidence of the same condition occurring in dogs. However, like with DCM, there is little research done to arrive at a strong conclusion. Within GRAS Notice 879, the issue of possible anti-nutritive effects was resolved by the manufacturer, including steps to remove suspected anti-nutritive compounds from their products during the manufacturing process. Presently, Intertek is not aware of how common it is within industry to remove anti-nutritive factors. The point will need to be discussed within the ingredient definition request or GRAS conclusion, and evidence would need to be provided. Separate to the discussion on anti-nutritive factors, there is a requirement to directly support the safety of the faba bean ingredient in dogs under the intended conditions of use. The current studies of faba bean ingredients in the published literature are insufficient to support safety. This is primarily because the studies use too few animals and the duration of exposure is too short. In a few cases, the faba bean ingredient was administered to dogs in diets containing additional nutrients which would confound any findings of anti-nutritive effects under normal use conditions. Some studies in rats have been identified and were included in GRAS Notice 879. These studies had durations of 2 to 4 weeks and considered potential effects of faba beans, protein isolate, and covicing, which is one of the purported anti-nutritive factors. While the results of the studies would be helpful to include to provide a more complete safety narrative, it's been our experience that the FDA does not consider extrapolation between species unless these species are closely related. Therefore, none of the currently available safety studies are sufficient to act as the pivotal safety evidence for any faba bean flour or ingredient safety discussion. Based on the available safety data discussed in the previous slide, new target animal studies will need to be conducted. The study should follow the FDA guidance for Industry 185 and 221. In particular, the study duration should be 6 months or longer if the feed ingredient is intended to be fed continuously. The animals used should be the most sensitive life stage, and the dose group should include a control, a group at the intended use level, and 3 times and 5 times the overdose groups. The guidance provides a comprehensive list of parameters to study. The categories of the parameters are included on this slide. So these would include hematology, blood chemistry, body weight gain, feed intake, and parameters relevant to identifying the DCM and the anti-nutritive effects. It must be noted that the target animal study will be specific to a faba bean ingredient processed under the conditions specific to that product. While some bridging between very similar ingredients may be possible, it is unlikely that a single target animal study could be used to support all types of faba bean ingredients. Finally, it is recommended that a pre-market consultation be held with the FDA before any study is initiated. The FDA provides an opportunity for applicants to have study protocols and other information reviewed by the FDA to ensure that the design will meet the FDA's needs when conducting the safety evaluation. So, to summarize the presentation, Intertek has identified many gaps in the publicly available information that will need to be addressed for a successful GRAS conclusion or ingredient definition request. Members of PIC and Pulse Canada will need to obtain this information or conduct studies highlighted in the feasibility assessment in order to prepare a complete regulatory submission for the intended use of their faba bean ingredient in dog food. The compositional, manufacturing, and intended use requirements are expected to be resolved easily. The greatest effort would be in establishing the safety of the faba bean ingredient in dogs through a target animal safety study. Should PIC and Pulse Canada or their individual members need regulatory support relating to an AAFCO ingredient definition request or GRAS conclusion and notification, including coordinating on the design of the studies, communication with the FDA, or stewardship tasks after the submission, Intertek is available to assist with this. So this concludes my presentation, and I'd like to thank you for your attention and any questions that you may have. If you'd like to contact Intertek about this presentation or any other regulatory questions you may have, please feel free to reach out by email or telephone. And now I'll turn the mic over to Chris and Julianne.
Great. Thanks so much, Brandon, for taking the time to walk us through that presentation and your report. I might kick things off with just some questions. I actually have a few here for you, but maybe to start off, looking at the existing AAFCO definitions that are in place for pulse flour, pulse protein, pulse starch, and fiber. They are, the way that they're published is the language around them is pretty general. It's a rather general description. However, as you outlined, the information that needs to be submitted to AAFCO to get those definitions is very specific. You talked about company specific information, batch to batch data. So I guess my question is, if one company is successful in getting an AAFCO ingredient definition based on their data, is it okay for others to utilize that same definition for their ingredient, provided that it aligns with that general description? So that would be sort of like part one. And then in a case where they have an ingredient that is somewhat different than what that general definition description is, do they just in that case, do almost like an amendment request, or can you just touch on the process for that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so if the AAFCO ingredient is listed, then anybody who can conform to that definition can then market the ingredient under that ingredient definition, as long as the manufacturing is met and all of the conditions are met as well. In terms of the second question, again, yes, if there's slight differences between the pulse ingredient and the ingredient that the manufacturer wants to market, they can submit an amendment request to AAFCO to have either the definition changed or possibly a follow-on definition. So, like, for instance, pulse fiber is definition 60.113, and perhaps there could be a 60.113A if there's some differences in that manufacturing process or
Wonderful.
the composition or other parameters of the ingredients, not just manufacturing.
Okay, great. I could keep going with a few questions and encourage all of our attendees, if you have any questions for Brandon or for Chris or myself, please just enter those into the chat box. Anything from you, Chris? Or
Yeah, I do have a question. Talking about the regulatory landscape, you touched a little bit on differences in state by state laws and rules around regulation around feed. I'm just curious if you actually do a bit of a search of faba bean use in pet food in the United States, there are instances where they are coming up as an ingredient in dog foods. I'm just wondering if that would be an instance of non-compliance and or perhaps differences in state laws and regulations that would facilitate that.
Yeah, it's possible that it could be due to state laws. Individual states have their own documentation, and they can either incorporate by reference the AAFCO official publication. Some states may also have their own separate list of ingredients that they've considered. I can't speak to whether or not it's an unapproved use of the faba bean ingredients.
Thank you.
Another question from me. You mentioned you talked about the two different routes, and with the GRAS route, that potential that eventually that becomes adopted by AAFCO. I was just curious if you knew how common that is, or is there any way to tell how often it is that the ingredients that are in AAFCO, particularly nowadays, are going that GRAS route?
Well, I think the best way to do that is by first looking at the US FDA website, which includes a database of all of the animal GRAS notices, animal food GRAS notices, of which I think at last count there's something close to 60. It's definitely less than 100. This is compared to the over 1,000 human food GRAS notices that there are. So it's definitely a less popular route currently. Most things seem to be going through the AAFCO route presently. And then as far as the introduction of GRAS notices that have no question letters, there is a separate section within the AAFCO official publication just listing out the GRAS notices with no question letters.
So I'll maybe ask another question. So we talked about, as part of that safety assessment, just consideration of the anti-nutritional components that are found in the ingredient. And I was just curious, with faba beans, we sort of mentioned it at the beginning of the webinar, there is efforts being made in the Canadian industry to move to production of varieties that are lower in anti-nutritional factors like tannins and lysine, conlysine. Have you seen ever in other ingredient definitions that things are variety specific, or does that get just captured behind the scenes?
Well, I think the classic example of that would be with canola, right? Which is the low acid variety. But yeah, usually it's what's done by industry best practices. If there is a noted effect and a noted difference that a particular variety might have, it might be included in the AAFCO ingredient definition that there would be a guarantee for a minimum of, for example, covicine and visine.
Okay. I've got a question for you, Chris, if you don't mind.
Oh.
So
Heads up, nice. Just kidding.
in terms of the nutritional advantages for including faba bean and other pulse ingredients, like what would you say are sort of those main nutritional advantages for pet food formulations, and like how does that play into like inclusion rates and what ingredients that they may be sort of displacing or some substituting for. Can you speak to that?
I think the primary advantage of where you would look to pulses right now, as if they're a replacement for, say, grains, you're going to be looking at pulses for energy as a source of starch, but also some protein, perhaps, that might allow the manufacturer to reduce some of the animal source proteins. It's important to note that in many instances, you're not creating a vegan or vegetarian pet food. You will have some animal product in there, but I think it's just adjusting those ratios, and the micronutrient composition of pulses are going to actually help with that and might help reduce the need for fortificants in some cases. But I would say also, to Brandon's point earlier, you would have to consider the upfront processing as well, because the anti-nutritional factors that might go in might affect the bioavailability, and it might affect how much famine would go into the product. And as well, you would want to be meeting protein quality. Dogs consume static diets. It's generally the only food that they consume. So they have to get everything in one place. And some of the recent analysis around protein quality, the protein quality of faba beans, now this is for humans, and using rat models and things like that, it's generally lower than other pulses, but it might be offset by the level of protein. That might be offset by the level of protein that you get per gram. So lower protein quality, but you're able to put higher amounts of protein per gram. So to Brandon's point, all of these things would need to be assessed in the safety assessment, because it certainly is fluid in some cases, and there's a lot of moving parts given the nutrient density and what they bring to the table.
Another question, just with respect to that longer term study, Brandon, that you identified that is really needed for faba beans. Do you have any idea of the cost of that kind of study as sort of part one? And then also, does the ingredient that is, or the ingredients that are tested in that study, this sort of goes back to that general description versus the very company specific, batch to batch information. Does the ingredient in that study also have to link up to the specific information about, all of the detailed compositional information and batch information that would be part of a ingredient application, or does it just need to meet the requirements of that general description if it's going to be in the published literature?
If the study is going to be in the published literature, I mean, you should be submitting the study with this particular batch that's representative of the feed that's being produced by that manufacturer. The feed itself, or the ingredient itself, should have the appropriate manufacturing and general composition. You don't need to have an exact match,
Yeah.
but then for any follow-on users of that information, they would need to consider, is our concentration of co-lysine or of crude fiber, are these, similar to what was investigated?
Right. Okay. Great. Any other questions from you, Chris?
I do. I just have one. Brandon, can you just discuss timelines with respect to the submission process, whether it be going the AAFCO route or a self-determined GRAS where you submit your GRAS to the FDA and they review and send a letter out of no objection?
Yeah, of
Both
course.
avenues.
So in terms of both, the document preparation is about the same duration to get all your ducks in a row. And then to actually submit the dossier to AAFCO, you're looking at a time frame between 1 to possibly 3 years, depending on the complexity of it and whether the data is sufficient. This is also including the fact that there's going to be some back and forth between the different committee members. So as you submit an AAFCO ingredient definition, like I said in the presentation, you're looking at waiting for the next meeting of the IDC panel, and then after that, you're waiting for the next meeting of the general membership before you finally get into the AAFCO official publication. For GRAS, the process is much faster with caveat. The GRAS conclusion, like I said, can be done independently, and it would take about usually 6 months to assemble your documents, convene your panel, and arrive at a conclusion that's got the expert panel signing off on it, if everything goes well. And from then you can legally market your ingredient. Of course, there's the issues that were raised about needing to notify and getting that wider acceptance at state level. And so for that, you're looking at submitting GRAS notices to the FDA, and you're probably looking at about 1 or 2 years time for evaluation. And this is mostly to do with the availability of the FDA to conduct the evaluations as well, because they're getting a lot of both AAFCO applications and GRAS notices and food additive petitions.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think with that, we'll close things off. I just want to, again, thanks to you, Brandon, for sharing your expertise with us today and the findings of your report. Also to my co-host, Chris, for moderating with me. And also want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out either directly to Chris or myself. And we can also put you in touch with Brandon. Couple reminders, we will be circulating a link to the recording of the webinar for registered participants. You could also access that copy of Intertech's report underneath the stage on the platform here, and that will also be sent out to you via email. In addition, we're going to send you a survey providing you an opportunity to give us with some feedback, particularly on the input, give us some input on future direction into research in this area and what you want to see prioritized. So with that, we'll officially wrap things up. Just want to thank you all again for coming and wish you a good rest of the day.